Hello, my name is Delaney Goodman, and I'm going to be presenting on the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. So to give a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about, I am going to give you an overview of No Child Left Behind by talking about who created the artifact, when and where it was produced, who was expected to utilize it, and the purpose behind it. I'm also going to discuss some assumptions about school knowledge, the teacher roles, nature of learning, and the organization of educational experiences. As well, I'm going to talk about the philosophies of education and curriculum and the significance that this had on the K-12 educational setting. So to give a little bit of a background, this act was proposed on January 23rd, 2001 by George W. Bush. It was accompanied by Representatives George Miller, John Boehner, Ted Kennedy, Senator Ted Kennedy, and Judd Gregg. They were all co-authors of this bill. It was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives on May 23rd of 2001 through a vote of 384 to 45, but it was passed through both houses and signed into law on January 8th of 2002. This was a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. It was designed to address variability in state policies, which required states to test more and set more ambitious and uniform improvement goals for their schools. So it prescribed sanctions for schools that failed to meet these goals. It tried to create uniformity within the state's policies for education because there was much variability. There wasn't much guidelines. So No Child Left Behind was designed to address this variability in the state's policies. The implementation, though, depended on the states enacting the policies and the practices with fidelity. So even though there was a federal law in place, it really depended on whether the states were enacting the policies in the way that they were supposed to. This did require students to be tested in reading and math in grades 3 through 8, and once students were in high school. Science had to be tested at least once in each of the grade spans. So once in the grade span of 3rd through 5th, once in the grade span of 6th through 9th, and once in the grade span of 10th through 12th grade. So there were 4 key components of the No Child Left Behind Act. The biggest and probably the most influential towards its failure was stronger accountability. So with stronger accountability, they wanted to be able to hold schools accountable for student progress of subcategories, minority groups, low income, struggling learners. So they did place an emphasis on stronger accountability. With that came adequate yearly progress. Adequate yearly progress was not only overall, so needing to meet a goal for everyone as a whole, but for each individual subgroup as well. They had to meet participation requirements and performance requirements on an academic achiever of academic performance that was determined by the state. So in 2014, all schools were required to have 100% proficiency for almost all students, including those with severe disabilities. So the adequate yearly progress was a way to track your progress towards achieving that goal of 100%. They did end up saying that 95% proficiency was okay, but the goal was 100% proficiency. So states were required to disaggregate scores by subgroups. So they couldn't just do a whole group, like the average score of everybody, but instead they had to break it down into low income students, African American students, Hispanic students, English learners. And there were consequences for not meeting the adequate yearly progress, which became more severe if it was continuous failure. So year 1 wasn't as severe. There really weren't many consequences, but year 2, there were stronger sanctions, and it continued to get harder as the time went. Another key component of stronger accountability was the fact that states had to create academic standards and learning objectives for both reading and math. And that is how they base their adequate yearly progress on whether students achieve those goals or those standards or not. The next key component was greater flexibility in the use of federal funds for states, school districts, and schools. There was also more choices for parents of children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So one of these sanctions, if schools were to not meet adequate yearly progress for a couple years in a row, is that children could decide to go to school in another district, or not another district, I'm sorry, in another school in the district that was performing at a higher scale. So this did provide more choices for parents of children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So they didn't have to get stuck in a school that was performing below the standard of No Child Left Behind. Also, another key component was utilizing teaching methods that have been proven to work. So effective evidence-based practices that could be used in the classroom. So a description of the impact of No Child Left Behind, I think that it's important to realize that adequate yearly progress was a staple in closing the achievement gap through accountability. So the purpose was to make sure that all students were receiving the education that they deserve and were not being left behind or pushed into vocational training based on their background, based on the fact that they're a minority or they're disadvantaged. So making sure that everyone is reaching proficiency, which was the goal for 2014, 95 to 100% proficiency, really helped to ensure that no child is left behind. It was aimed at closing that achievement gap between the advantaged and the disadvantaged. However, while it's great in theory, this push towards accountability is one of the most significant reasons why this reform was a failure. So digging into it a little deeper, some of the assumptions that I realized that have to do with school knowledge is that the No Child Left Behind Act poses obstacles to an authentic critical learning environment. So I don't believe that it promoted higher learning or critical thinking skills, but instead it promoted rote memorization. So a lot of us have heard of teaching to the test, which unfortunately I still feel is happening in some classrooms. However, when you get in those grades where the subjects are tested, a lot of teachers think of what's going to be on the test and they try to teach the students exactly how to answer those questions. So instead of gauging students and having them critically think about a topic, more teachers are focused on giving students easy ways to remember how to solve something or the answer to something like random social studies facts because they don't know what's going to be on the test, right? So with them not knowing what's going to be on the test and knowing that the test is multiple choice, they teach to the test and it's more of recall than it is deep critical thinking about topics. Students are expected to regurgitate information that they learn throughout the school year. So a lot of what teachers do is rote memorization. They're not really diving into that information that'll help students store it in their long-term memory, but instead they're giving students practice in order to remember it for a short time, take the standardized test, and then move on and forget it. So I definitely believe that authentic critical learning is not happening and it's not meaningful because of this act. When it comes to the philosophies of education, I felt that this aligned with realism, which emphasizes that reality, knowledge, and value exist independent of the human mind. So this is what John Locke believed to be a blank slate, which means that students' minds are filled with information. So they are born with nothing in their mind. Their experiences are what teaches them everything. So teachers are able to fill the minds of students with information. It's like they come into the classroom, they have no prior knowledge, they have nothing other than what we give to them. So we are just pouring information into them and they are expected to take it on like they were a blank slate. So standardized testing and standardization, which was a huge part of the No Child Left Behind Act, assumes that children are blank slates and that they are passive recipients of content rather than active constructors of meaning who bring their prior knowledge with them. So rather than them constructing their own knowledge and critically thinking about a topic and finding the answer for themselves, instead, teachers were pouring the information onto the students and expecting them to memorize it in order to pass the state assessment because teachers were afraid of that accountability aspect. So they really were teaching to the test and using rote memorization rather than teaching students how to critically think. Another assumption that can be made is about the nature of learning. So I believe that learning versus schooling has to do with the fact that learning is all about exploring your interests and your passions to acquire knowledge through studying or being taught. Schooling is finding information about a topic that's prescribed for you. So to me, school is standardized and learning is personal. This means that in school, which is standardized, students are obtaining information from certain people at certain times. There's no application of learning. The topics are prescribed for the students. Now we try to appeal to the students' interests and let them explore things that they want to learn about, and we try to make learning meaningful. But during this time, teachers were only interested in teaching the standards exactly what they needed to have the students ready to take that test. So students were expected to intake this information as a blank slate, have no prior background knowledge, no application of learning in the real life, because to them, it was all about being able to take that assessment at the end of the year and get a passing score rather than taking that information and actually using it in real life. So to me, I felt that the No Child Left Behind Act was more leaning more towards schooling than it was learning. It wasn't authentic. They didn't critically think, and most students probably were not interested or passionate about the topics that they were learning. Instead, they were being forced to learn standards that they weren't interested in or that were prescribed for them by the state. Another thing we can look at is the organization of educational experiences. So I believe I interpreted this as organizing the curriculum or learning activities. So with No Child Left Behind, I felt that, and research shows us that the curriculum was designed in a rigid and highly structured way. So there was a strict curriculum pacing guide. Teachers were rushing through the curriculum. There was teacher autonomy diminished. So, a lot of teachers like being able to teach what they want and decide what to spend more time on and what not to spend a lot of time on, and doing what's best for your students. But when it came to No Child Left Behind and you didn't know what your students were going to be tested over, you had to go through everything as quickly as you could and get it all down, because at the end of the year, you didn't want something to be on the test that your students weren't exposed to, right? So the autonomy of the teachers diminished. It really was following a strict curriculum pacing guide because you didn't want to not teach anything and then students be tested on it. Also, I felt that learning activities did become more about rote memorization than authentic learning experiences, like I previously stated. So the organization of these learning experiences really was structured in the way that the students need to remember it for the test and then move on. It had a lot of repetition and drill practices. So take, for example, multiplication facts. Instead of genuinely learning that 7 times 6 is 7 groups of 6, we were just taught that 7 times 6 is 42, right? So we need to be able to recall that on standardized tests. And if we couldn't, it didn't matter if we understood that 7 times 6 is 7 groups of 6 and that 6 times 7 is 6 groups of 7. That didn't matter. As long as we could recall it on the test, we were successful. So it really was a lot of repetition and drill practices and rote memorization. There was less teacher involvement in the organization of educational experiences, and it created a less flexible learning environment because there was such a push for higher test scores and teacher accountability that it became really uniform in the fact that teachers were teaching the same exact standards and they were teaching it strictly from the pacing guide to ensure that students did well on the test. One of the most important things to think about when it comes to artifacts and educational history is the significance that it had on the K-12 educational setting. So one of the biggest things that this artifact did for education is the fact that it expanded the role of the federal legislation and it created state accountability systems. I believe that state accountability systems are important because we don't want certain students to be not represented and not given a fair education. However, I do believe that the push for accountability was done the wrong way in this artifact. It started forcing teachers to engage in practices that they knew were not best practices. It also led to equality in education. There's not total equality in education. However, it was a push towards equality. Like I just stated, it pushed for everyone to have a fair education. And while there's still ways to go, because there's still groups that are being provided with less opportunities in the educational setting than others are, it started that conversation around the fact that there does need to be equality and equity in education. And There wasn't at the time. There still isn't complete equality or equity in education, but this started that discussion around it, and that's a huge thing in education. With this, it put more emphasis on struggling students. So back then, they would push struggling students towards vocational school rather than preparing them for college. Um, and this act made that not possible because every student at the end of the year, despite their background, had to take the assessment and be proficient. That was the goal, anyways, by 2014, which was a failure, but it was still a goal. It also improved teacher qualifications because teachers had to be highly qualified under the No Child Left Behind Act to be in a classroom. So when it comes to analogous artifacts, the most popular one that I found was the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was the reauthorization of the No Child Left Behind Act. So the testing requirements stayed the same. The punishments for low test performance were still present. However, the power to decide which consequences that occurred or sanctions that occurred to the school was up to the state. Unattainable adequate yearly progress no longer existed, but it was replaced by state sanctions on schools. The Every Student Succeed Act provides states with the flexibility to develop accountability systems that measure student success in their respective states. However, identifications of schools that are in need of improvement were not only based on test scores, but they also had to be accompanied by one or more academic or quality indicator. Lastly, one of the biggest pushes in the Every Student Succeeds Act is the use of formative assessment and diagnostic assessment to inform instruction. This was a huge aspect of the Every Student Succeeds Act, and we still see a lot of this happening in the current day. I know that Gwinnett County is really big on formative assessment because it is used to tell us what students need and how we can help them. So that was one of the biggest differences between No Child Left Behind and the Every Student Succeeds Act. There was this quote that I read that I felt like really summed up the relationship between No Child Left Behind and ESSA. So I'm going to go ahead and read that. It says, "We don't want to leave any child behind, but we will hold them back if they aren't successful on the test. We want highly qualified teachers, but we will replace their expertise with paced, scripted curricula. We will only allow schools to adopt no-fail curricula, but the high stakes will be placed on children and teachers when the program fails, as they do time and again. Although maybe not the intent of the law, these are the practices by which history will remember No Child Left Behind and Reading First. Every Student Succeed Act has an opportunity with the support of states and school districts to match intent with practice to support teachers and children in the teaching and learning of literacy." Based on the history of No Child Left Behind and kind of what's already happened with it, I thought about some of the future uses of this act. So one thing is equality of education with all students. I think that as we move further into the century and we continue to use subcategories of historically disadvantaged and oppressed students and struggling learners, there will be more of a push for equality. When we see that the test scores are lower significantly for a specific subcategory, we can focus in and figure out what we need to do, what interventions we need to do to provide equity in the classroom. I do think that this started that movement and really got it going along and trying to find ways to make sure that all students were being provided with opportunities that were fair. So I do think that that's going to continue to be used in the future as we continue to strive for equity. I also think that, there's been educational reforms that have already surfaced and aim to address No Child Left Behind issues. There was the Every Student Succeeds Act, there's Race to the Top. Standardized testing and state school accountability have persisted in these reforms, and they've paved the way for federal involvement in education. So I think that even though educational reforms have already surfaced, I do think that it's going to change again probably, but No Child Left Behind really made that way for federal involvement in education. And I think that it's going to have that lasting legacy and it's going to continue. I also am really interested in the fact that No Child Left Behind talks about highly qualified educators, right? But we are currently in a teacher shortage, and there are states that are hiring educators who are not qualified, or highly qualified. We have the teacher candidate residency program, which I was a part of at UNG last year. I was not highly qualified, but I was a classroom teacher with my own students, no one else in there with me. And while I did everything I could to be the great teacher that I knew I could be, I wasn't highly qualified at the time. I didn't have a degree until after my first year of teaching. So it's interesting to me the emphasis that was placed on highly qualified educators and how you had to have a degree to be in a classroom. But now we are coming out with programs such as these to help with teacher retention. And we're doing all these things because of the teacher shortage. So I'm curious to see how we change from highly qualified teachers to anybody, it feels like. So I am interested to see the future use of No Child Left Behind and its emphasis on highly qualified educators to see if that continues or if they become more lenient on it. Lastly, I want to talk about curriculum and instruction. One of the most important things that I learned from this artifact when it comes to curriculum and instruction is the emphasis that is placed on how educational reform can leave a lasting impact on education and instructional practices. So it can lead to a shift in curriculum planning, and it can influence the instructional strategies teachers use in the classroom. So rather than providing meaningful learning, some teachers are using rote memorization because of No Child Left Behind, right? And we know that that's not as effective, but in order for the students to pass the test, they use rote memorization. Curriculum planning can shift because of the pacing. And to me, it helped demonstrate how education has strived to create a proper education for all students and how educational reform is informed by prior reforms and issues that need to be addressed. So I believe that we really do look at the history of education and we try to create a curriculum that is fair for students, and we base our instruction on the goals of our curriculum and accountability. I think that it's important to understand how prior reforms have impacted the newer reforms. So while the No Child Left Behind Act was theoretically good, it had a lot of issues that had to be addressed through the Every Student Succeeds Act. And I think that's really interesting to think about because there's going to be many more. And it's unique to think about how these educational reforms can change the way we teach the curriculum and the instructional strategies that we use. But that is all I have for this project. Here are my references, and that is it. Thank you.